We recently learned how to solve a quadratic equation by completing the square. The good news about completing the square is it will work for every quadratic equation in the whole wide world. Any quadratic equation can be solved by completing the square. That's not true of factoring, and that's not true of the square root method. The bad news is sometimes as we solve, it's a pain in the neck. If this leading coefficient is not the number 1, you end up dealing with all sorts of fractions. So what we're going to do is we're going to develop something known as the quadratic formula. My guess is there's a good chance you've probably seen this before, but you might not have seen this. Where does the quadratic formula come from? The quadratic formula is really a special case of just completing the square. So we're going to take this general equation and complete the square. Well, in order to do that, the first number, the leading coefficient, has to be a 1. So we would divide everything by a. X squared plus b over ax plus c over a equals 0. And then we move the c over a over. X squared plus b over x equals minus c over a. Now we've got to compute our magic number. So we come off to the side, we take b over a, we divide it by 2, and we square it. I'm going to think of 2 as a fraction, 2 over 1. I'm going to flip and multiply. So this is b over a times a half squared. So that's b over 2a squared. When I square everything, I get b squared up on top. I get 4a squared down on bottom. So there's my magic quote number, if you will. Lots of letters in it. Alright, so we add that to both sides. X squared plus b over ax plus b squared over 4a squared equals b squared over 4a squared minus c over a. The left-hand side. The left-hand side, we know, since we're completing the square, will factor as a perfect square. It's got to be x, and then it's this number right here, right before we did the squaring. So plus b over 2a. Now, this thing, on the other hand, what I'd really like to do is have a common denominator here, so I can subtract these fractions. I notice if I take the second fraction and multiply top and bottom by 4a, then down on bottom I'm going to have 4a squared, which matches the 4a squared there. So I can write this as b squared minus, I'm just going to switch the order here, I'm going to write it as 4ac, all divided by 4a squared. Alright, I know this is looking gruesome. Trust me, it's going to get slightly better. You'll see the quadratic formula drop out here in a minute if you've seen it before. I square root both sides. So x plus b over 2a equals plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 4a squared. So x is negative b over 2a plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac up on top, and down on bottom the square root of 4 happens to be a nice number, it's 2, and a squared, square root, square and square root reduce each other, so you get 2a. So you end up with what is known as the quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. The beauty of the quadratic formula is that it can be used to solve any quadratic equation in the whole wide world. The bad news is, in order to use it, you have to memorize it. So there's your first thing. You need to sit down and memorize this quadratic formula. Here's an idea. I've seen this work for students in the past. Go to Google and go for quadratic formula song baby, and there's this really obnoxious YouTube video with a song, and it happens to have a baby in it, and it sings the quadratic formula over and over again, and It's one of those, you listen to it and the song is so annoying that it just kind of drills into your head and you will memorize the quadratic formula. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. I understand that's kind of goofy. As you use it, write it down every single time. And just by writing it down over and over again, you'll probably memorize it. The other nice thing about the quadratic formula is these numbers, A, B, and C, don't have to be nice numbers. They could be fractions, they could be decimals, they could be anything. You can plug them in, use this formula, grind it out. It's going to be some calculator work, and you'll get your answers. Alright, so let's give it a try and see how it actually works. 4x squared minus 2x minus 9 equals 0. Alright, x equals negative b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. b is the number negative 2, so negative b will be negative 2, which is positive 2, plus or minus the square root of b squared. B squared is negative 2, I'm sorry, b is negative 2, so b squared is 4 minus 4 times a is the number 4 times c is the number negative 9. All divided by 2a. A is the number 4, so 2a is 8. So that's 2 plus or minus. Here's where the calculator comes in handy. 4 minus 4 times negative 9. Calculator tells me that's 148, so I have square root of 148 all over 8. Now, what you should look for is to simplify. The square root of 148, unfortunately, is not a nice number. But 148 does happen to be, I'm going to write it up here, 148 happens to be 4 times 37. And the square root of 4 is a nice number. So I'm going to write this as 2 plus or minus 2 square roots of 37 over 8. And then finally I notice I have a 2 here, and an 8 there. I have even everywhere, so I can reduce. My final answer, I would write it as 1 plus or minus square root of 37 over 4. I divide everything by 2. So you can see the beauty of the quadratic formula is that once you memorize it, it's really just a matter of plugging numbers in and then doing a little arithmetic. Whereas if I wanted to solve this one by completing the square, first thing I'd have to do is divide everything by 4, which is going to give me all sorts of fractions. It's going to make the problem challenging. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. Same deal. If I had to complete the square, I'd have to divide by 2, which would give me a whole bunch of ugly fractions to deal with. Now, the one thing with this one is before you use the quadratic formula, to use the quadratic formula, you've got to have the 0 on one side. So be careful of that. 2x squared minus 3x minus 5 is 0. So, x equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. I force you to write that down over and over again so that you memorize it. Negative b. Well, b is negative 3, so negative b is negative 3, which is 3. Plus or minus the square root of, here's one of the biggest mistakes I see people make. They'll take here and they'll write negative 3 squared. And then they'll push that into their calculator, negative 3 squared, and the calculator says negative 9. Tilt that so you can see a little better. Don't do this. This is an order of operations thing. We wrote the wrong thing. Powers come before negatives, so the calculator does it correctly. It does 3 squared, and then it does the minus. If you're going to use your calculator, you really need to write it that way. So it does negative 3 times negative 3. My suggestion is don't write it that way. Just do it in your head. You know that negative 3 squared gives you a positive 9. So don't write negative 3 squared there. Just write the number 9. That's the single biggest mistake that people make when using the quadratic formula, is that minus sign right there. So again, my suggestion is don't even write this. Just write the number 9 because you know that's the right answer. Alright, anyway, we have b squared minus 4 times A times C, all over 2A. 2A is 4. So that's 3, plus or minus, grab my calculator, 9 minus 4 times 2 times negative 5. Calculator says that's 49. And 49 is a good number because I can do square root of 49. Square root of 49 happens to be 7, all over 4. So what I would do now is I would split this. I would say x is 3 plus 7 is 10 over 4, which is 5 halves. Or x is 3 minus 7 is negative 4 over 4, which is negative 1. What this tells me is I got relatively nice answers, no square roots left. This thing would have factored. But here's my opinion. If this number is not the number 1, factoring is kind of a pain in the neck. So personally, I wouldn't have even tried to factor this one. When I see that this first number is not the number 1, I don't try to factor. I jump right to the formula. Because even if it would have factored, I think it's easier to just plug the numbers in, do the little bit of calculations, and get the two numbers, rather than having to do that factor by grouping method that we talked about so long ago. That's my opinion. If you really like to factor, and if you are really good at factoring, go ahead and factor. Alright, one more problem, and then we'll take a short break, and we'll look at a couple word problems. Oh, applications, you can see them there already. Okay, well this one's all set up for using the quadratic formula. It's got 0 on one side. So x is negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. That's 4 plus or minus square root of negative 4 squared is 16. See how I'm just writing the 16 down, avoiding that mistake with the minus sign. Minus 4 times a is 1 times c is 13 all over 2a. That's 2 times 1, which is 2. So that's 4 plus or minus, grabbing my calculator, 16 minus 4 times 1 times 13. Calculator tells me that's negative 36. Which is okay. I just wanted to point out that this certainly can happen. What this means is we have 4 plus or minus 6i. Remember? Complex numbers, going back to when we had negatives underneath our square roots. Not a big deal. Since it's a negative, we know we get an I. And then finally, everything is even, so we can reduce to plus or minus 3i. It is certainly possible to get complex numbers. If you do, don't worry about it. It's what it is. Take them.